President Roosevelt was reluctant to address issues involving ethnic, racial, and religious minorities during the war. While the president gave lip service to the American ideal of a religious and colorblind democracy, FDR remained reluctant to use his office to alter social attitudes about Chinese and Japanese Americans, African Americans, Mexican Americans, Italians, and Jews. To avoid a march on Washington proposed by civil rights leaders, the president issued an executive order in 1941 ending discrimination in defense-related employment. One of the consequences of the war partially changed attitudes as young men fought alongside Jews or Mexican Americans. Some young men in uniform learned tolerance because they depended on servicemen who were Jews or Catholics. However, many veterans still did not want members of certain minority groups to move into their town or neighborhood after the war. Older Americans listened to the rhetoric about a multicultural America, but it failed to change the beliefs of most Americans. Polls taken during the war and afterward suggested continued hostility by most white Protestant Americans to Asians, African Americans, Mexican Americans, Jews, and Italian Catholics. Even Irish Catholics were still despised by many Protestants, especially in the South. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, many West Coast residents became nervous about Japanese Americans. The media and politicians contributed to the anti-Japanese hysteria. Radio commentators were the worst, reporting phony stories about sabotage and disloyalty. During the war, the press drew a distinction between good Germans and the Nazis, avoiding a repeat of the anti-German hysteria of World War I. But all Japanese were treated with suspicion. Italian and German minorities were assumed to be loyal unless there was evidence of disloyalty, while all Japanese were considered suspect. Japanese Americans in several cities wired the Roosevelt administration with petitions of loyalty. Initially, the federal government encouraged Japanese Americans to move east, and about 8,000 to 10,000 that did could appeal for exemption from the later internment. Political pressure built on FDR to take action against the Japanese community, and fearing that Democrats might lose seats in Congress in 1942 if he did not act, he bowed to the prejudice and political opportunism of West Coast political leaders and authorized the internment of Japanese Americans by issuing Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942. The president did not want to deal directly with the issue, and left it to Secretary of War Henry Stimson, a Republican, to implement. The public attitudes that led FDR to issue the order were best expressed by Governor Chase Clark of Idaho. Quote, "Japanese live like rats, breed like rats, and act like rats." On March 27, 1942, Japanese Americans living in the western part of the United States were given 48 hours to dispose of their homes and property and report for evacuation. Although 1/3 of the population of Hawaii was of Japanese ancestry, the community established good relations with the American military and remained exempt from the executive order, one of the ironies of the internment. On March 30, 1942, Japanese Americans reported to one of 15 assembly points, like a brewery in Tacoma, Washington, or Pasadena's Rose Bowl, for transfer to internment camps stretching from Arkansas to California. About 120,000 Japanese Americans spent the war years in internment camps. Gordon Hirabayashi, a senior at the University of Washington, and another college student, Fred Korematsu, challenged the relocation orders in separate cases, but the federal courts and the Supreme Court upheld the convictions on national security grounds that gave the president greater authority in wartime. Japanese Americans could get out of the camps if they joined the military, and 17,000 joined up. A few got out by going to college in the East, as Syracuse University invited about 30 Japanese Americans to attend, and larger numbers left the camps if they got war-related work. The vast majority remained in the camps that were run by the War Relocation Authority, behind barbed wire with military guards to prevent unauthorized departures. In 1944, Mitsuye Endo, a woman, challenged the internment and sued for release. The Supreme Court upheld the original evacuation, but ruled that loyal citizens could return home. Starting in December of 1944, the internees were allowed to leave. FDR waited to implement the order until after the 1944 elections. 40 years later, a federal court overturned the conviction of Fred Korematsu because he had not been allowed to see FBI documents at the time of his trial that concluded Japanese Americans did not pose a security threat. Congress apologized for the internment in 1982, and each surviving former internee was granted an official apology and $20,000 in 1988. President Roosevelt issued the Executive Order 8802 on June 1941 to end discrimination in war-related work, the first civil rights action by the federal government since Reconstruction. However, he refused to take leadership in ending discrimination in the military. African Americans served in segregated units in the Army and special all-African American units in the Army Air Corps, later the U.S. Air Force. The 99th Fighter Squadron became known as the Tuskegee Airmen. The Army and local whites were puzzled that African Americans wanted to fly, but by May 1945 there were 5 all-African American squadrons. There was one effort to encourage racial harmony in the military. In 1944, the Army produced The Negro Soldier, a documentary that positively portrayed African Americans in the military dating back to the Revolution. Efforts by civil rights leaders to persuade the president to encourage integration in the military failed. However, during the war, the Coast Guard integrated and the Navy reopened jobs to African Americans, so they were no longer restricted to messmen or stewards. By the end of the war, the Navy was effectively integrated. The Marines had been all white, but 20,000 African Americans served in the Marines during World War II, but most in segregated units. The Army remained segregated at the end of the war, although there were some limited experiments with integrated training camps and some unexpected de facto integration on the battlefield, especially at the Battle of the Bulge. Race riots developed at military camps during the war, as some white soldiers preferred to fight their African American fellow GIs with more gusto than fighting the Japanese or Germans. Back at home, African Americans wanted double V's, victory against the enemy and against racism. FDR preferred to let Eleanor take the lead since he did not want to alienate Southern white Democrats who chaired many congressional committees. A new civil rights organization, Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, led a campaign to desegregate public facilities in northern cities like Detroit. During the war, the Supreme Court struck one blow for civil rights. In 1944, in Smith v. Allwright, by an 8-1 decision, the court negated the white-only primary in a Texas case. The white-only primary was one of the major legal devices used in some southern states like Texas to deny African Americans the right to vote. Whites resented the movement of African Americans north during the war, looking for war-related jobs as they competed with whites in the South and North for jobs, promotions, and housing. This led to race riots in Mobile and Port Arthur as whites attacked African Americans. Southern whites resented the gains African Americans made in employment during the war. In the North, Polish Americans in Buffalo opposed efforts to integrate housing units to open up apartments or build housing for African Americans drawn to Buffalo for war-related jobs. In Detroit, conflict over the integration of public housing in 1943 led to the worst race riot of the war. The issue simmered for 4 months until a major clash between black and white teenage girls in Belle Isle Park on June 20, 1943, led to a citywide race riot. White mobs attacked and killed 25 African Americans, and African Americans dragged whites off streetcars, killing 9 in what became urban warfare between the races. FDR refused a request from the governor of Michigan to calm the waters, and federal troops were called to stop the rioting in the middle of the war. Another riot broke out in Harlem in New York City in 1943, before the Mayor LaGuardia and local black leaders could calm people angered by false reports of the killing of a juvenile by the police. Other race riots broke out at military facilities in the United States during the war. For African Americans, the major improvement during the war came in employment, as African American males and females found greater opportunities created by full employment and the war. Living standards improved for those African Americans who left the rural South and found jobs in defense-related industries or with the federal government. Jews continued to face widespread discrimination in employment, housing, colleges, and social organizations. Many companies would not hire Jews. Colleges like Columbia University had quotas on Jewish students. Hotels like those in Saratoga Springs, New York, would not admit Jewish guests. Social organizations like the Fort Orange Club in Albany and the Mohawk Club in Schenectady would not allow Jews to join. Restrictive agreements would not allow Jews to rent apartments or buy homes in certain neighborhoods or cities, like Darien, Connecticut. Efforts by Jewish organizations to persuade FDR to take action to try to save Jews in Europe failed. The Roosevelt administration agreed to accept only 1,000 war refugees during the war that were housed in 1944 at Fort Ontario in Oswego, New York. The president did not want to fight with anti-Semitic Southern congressmen over the refugee issue, and wanted to avoid making a special appeal to save the Jews of Europe from genocide as a diversion from winning the war that might alienate people on the home front.